In front of Buckingham Palace, a SWAT officer just slapped a royal guard in the face. The tourists gasped, and the cameras kept rolling. What happened next will transform the way you think about genuine power forever. This wasn't a passionate dispute or a misunderstanding. It was a cold, planned attack on tradition itself. The guard didn't move, talk, or even blink, but in just 10 seconds, something amazing happened that showed why you should never mess with the Queen's Guard. What happens next will leave you stunned. If you're as shocked as we were, press the like button, subscribe to see more stories like this, and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. That December morning, Lance Corporal Kaelen Drax stood outside the medieval gates of St. James's Palace. The frost was thick on the cobblestones. His breath made little clouds in the cold air, yet his face stayed completely calm. The scarlet wool of his tunic shone out against the gray sky over London, and the brass buttons were so shiny they seemed like mirrors. His bearskin headgear made him look even bigger, adding 8 inches to his already magnificent physique. He looked more like a statue than a man. To the casual observer, Drax's eyes were forward-facing and unblinking, but they were always sweeping the area with the trained awareness of someone who had spent 3 tours looking for hazards in Afghan villages. At 27, he walked with the quiet confidence of a seasoned veteran who had earned his position among the Queen's Guard through more than simply ceremony. The purple and green ribbon of his Afghanistan campaign medal was exactly straight on his chest, a subtle reminder of the soldier beneath the ceremonial attire. As the morning sun burst through the winter clouds, tourists began to gather. They took pictures of Drax, who was completely still, as they were amazed by how still he was. A young mother picked up her daughter, so she could see better. She whispered to her that the guards never moved, no matter what happened around them. An old American couple argued about whether the guard was real or not. Their voices were full of curiosity, which is what drove millions of people to see this live piece of British history. As more people came, they formed a semicircle around Drax's position, and the crowd's polite murmur filled the air. They talked quietly about how well the guards were known for their discipline, telling stories they had heard about guards standing through thunderstorms, tourists who fainted, and even terrorism alerts without moving. The kids looked at this man in shock, as if he were stuck in time. Their parents told them about the long history he stood for. Constable Gareth Veylan walked into this serene setting. His SWAT outfit set him apart from the respectful audience. His stride showed that he was impatient, since he was coping with London's never-ending logistical challenges. A delivery van had blocked an important intersection, and Veylan had been steering angry drivers around it for the past hour. Veylan's jaw was tense as he looked around, and his eyes narrowed at the mob that was treating Drax like a tourist spot. The constable had been on duty for 3 hours when he got 2 reports about domestic disturbances in a row. Then, he had to chase a shoplifter for 4 blocks through packed streets. When he got to the palace, he was already on edge since he thought he would have to deal with normal crowd management. The difference between the 2 men couldn't have been clearer. Drax stood still as a rock, his breathing so slow that it was hard to see, and all of his muscles were perfectly straight. His presence demanded respect because he had earned it through discipline in war zones, when moving meant living and staying motionless meant dying. Veylan walked back and forth behind the barrier, his energy coiled and irritated. He showed his authority by moving around and giving orders. Drax's immaculate boots and brass fittings reflected the flashes from tourists' cameras as they took pictures of him. A teenage girl tried to make him happy by swinging her arms and laughing with her friends behind their phones. An older man told his grandson how these guards kept the royal family safe, and how their training was so hard that nothing could break their focus. Veylan was getting more and more angry as he watched this, and his attitude got worse as he saw people treating a grown man like a statue. The delivery truck incident had made him feel helpless in the face of London's traffic problems. Now he saw hundreds of people treating this silent guard with more respect than most people treat working police officers. Drax's eyes stayed straight ahead, yet he could see everything that was going on around him. His training had taught him how to keep doing his ceremonial duties while also judging threats. This talent took years of work to achieve. The controlled breathing methods he learned in combat helped him keep his posture correct, even though the frigid winter air was getting through his wool uniform. As tour buses pulled up and let off additional people who wanted to see the famous changing of the guard event, the gathering grew in the morning. They were so excited as they traded cameras and compared images, everyone wanting to get the ideal shot of this living emblem of British military heritage. Veylan's radio squawked again, this time about another traffic accident that needed his attention. But he kept his eyes on Drax with what looked like anger. The guard's strictness seemed to parody the constable's own problems with authority, which made the situation tense, like storm clouds gathering on a clear day. The normal world of ceremonial duty was about to clash with the problems of modern policing, and neither man knew how much their lives were going to change. The last straw came when Veylan's radio buzzed with yet another traffic complaint. His sergeant's voice was barely hidden in the early air, and it was clear that he was angry. As he took in the message, the constable's face grew darker, and his jaw moved silently, while tourists continued to take pictures of Drax's still body. As Veylan attached the radio back to his belt, something changed in his manner. His eyes locked on the guard with a new intensity that had nothing to do with crowd control. Veylan walked closer to the rope that separated the ceremonial place from the public walkway. His boots scraped against the stones that were covered in frost. The tourists closest to him felt the change in the air and stopped talking as they watched this uniformed cop walk up to the traditionally hallowed border. Veylan looked like a nightclub bouncer who had eaten too many donuts. He walked with the brash assurance of someone who was used to getting what he wanted right away from people. His voice cut through the morning silence, sharp and commanding enough to make a few tourists move back without thinking. Veylan said, "Right then, you need to move along from this position." His remarks had the same tone as those of a traffic cop or petty criminal. They expected immediate compliance. People turned to look, and their cameras caught something they never thought they would see at the palace gates. Drax didn't move at all, and looked straight ahead, as if Veylan didn't exist. The guard's breathing stayed steady and controlled, just like it had been for the past 2 hours. His posture didn't shift, even though someone had directly challenged his authority. His training had taught him how to deal with distractions, hecklers, and even physical threats, but he always responded the same way, by being completely motionless. The tourists looked at each other awkwardly while Veylan waited for someone to say something, but no one did. A woman in her 40s whispered to her husband, "He's not allowed to move, is he?" Her friend nodded and said, "That's the whole point. They're like statues, famous for it." Their conversation was clear in the cool air, and Veylan's face turned red as civilians corrected his basic misunderstanding of the situation. Veylan's fury turned into something more sinister when he discovered that his usual threats didn't work on a man who had been trained to ignore Taliban fighters shooting at him from Afghan mountainsides. The constable's voice got louder and more forceful as he kept telling Drax to move. When silence was still his only answer, Veylan did something that had been against the rules for hundreds of years. He ducked under the rope barrier and went into the ceremonial space. People in the throng started to grumble, and then they were clearly worried as they saw this unusual break in royal decorum. People who had been casually taking pictures of tourists with their phones now turned their full attention to what was clearly becoming a serious situation. A teenage girl kept her device steady, recording everything as Veylan moved right in front of Drax's still body. Drax's peripheral vision saw Veylan coming, but his face stayed stone cold. He learned from 3 tours in Afghanistan that reacting to provocation only made things worse. Even as the policeman got close enough for Drax to smell the coffee on his breath, his muscles stayed locked in perfect military posture. Veylan's voice became more personal, and his tone changed from formal command to something less nice. "What's wrong? Did your costume's battery die?" he said, as a few tourists laughed uncomfortably before quickly regretting their remark. The joke didn't work in the early air, which showed how out of place this whole fight had become, as he faced something his police training had never prepared him for. People who didn't care about his authority. His countenance showed the psychological conflict he was going through. Every time he worked with someone, they had to acknowledge him in some way, either by following his orders or going against them. But Drax did neither. This complete rejection hit Veylan's professional identity right at its heart. A father in the crowd moved forward and spoke to the increasingly angry cop in a way that made him sound like a dad. "Officer, he's just doing his job," the man responded, his voice stern but polite. Veylan was even more embarrassed when a civilian stepped in, because he knew that everyone in the audience could see him not getting respect from a silent guard. Veylan's face twisted with rage when he saw the phones capturing his professional meltdown. The adolescent girl's camera caught every detail of his rising anger, which would soon be used as proof of a terrible mistake in judgment. His breathing got faster as his ego and anger took over years of SWAT training. As the constable glanced at Drax's calm face, he clenched his fists and looked for any sign of weakness in the guard's demeanor. Veylan's mind cracked when he couldn't find any. The portion of his brain that knew what would happen and what to do shut down, and all that was left was his wounded pride demanding satisfaction. The Drax kept watch, not knowing that his flawless discipline was about to be tested in a way that no ceremonial training had ever thought of. The moment hung in the cold December air like a picture that needed to be developed. Veylan's right hand slowly pulled back, and his face contorted with wrath while tourists kept taking pictures, not knowing they were about to catch something that would break decades of British military history. Drax stayed still in his ideal ceremonial pose, with his eyes fixed straight ahead even as the constable's palm was ready to hit him. The crowd could feel something bad coming, and their happy talk changed into murmurs as they turned their phones toward the fight. The sound of Veylan's palm hitting Drax's cheek broke the calm of the morning like a gunshot booming off the walls of the palace. The scream was so harsh and final that it echoed throughout the stone courtyard, making pigeons fly away from neighboring perches. Their wings beat against the unexpected violence. Drax's head moved a little with the contact, but then it went back to where it was before, and his face stayed the same, as if the hit had been nothing more than a gust of winter wind. Drax didn't flinch, blink, or lose his military stance as he took the hit, and the adolescent girl's phone recorded everything. His bearskin hat stayed in the right place, his brass buttons shone in the weak sunlight, and his body was as stiff as it had been just before the crash. The guard's respiration stayed steady, and his chest rose and fell with mechanical precision, even though his cheek hurt like hell. As the crowd realized what they had seen, their collective gasp turned into something louder and harsher. "Oh my God!" a woman at the front barrier yelled, breaking the startled hush that followed the smack. As soon as she started talking, more voices joined in. Tourists yelled, "You can't do that," as their easygoing morning sightseeing turned into something far more serious and scary. The kids in the crowd started to cry because they couldn't understand why someone would hurt the soldier they had just been adoring. A mother pulled her daughter closer and whispered, "Some people don't understand respect," her voice shaking with anger. The words were loud enough for everyone in the courtyard to hear, and they made her child feel better and condemned Veylan's behavior. He started to shake as he realized what he had done. The dozens of shocked eyes made him lose his confidence. The tourists looked at him like he had just kicked a puppy or knocked an ice cream cone out of a child's hand. Their faces went from confused to disgusted in a matter of seconds. Phones that had been recording how the guard was acting suddenly turned their attention to how the policeman had completely lost control of his job. An old guy stepped out of the crowd and pointed an accusatory finger at Veylan. His walking stick tapped against the cobblestones as he did so. "That man is serving his country," he said, his voice sounding like someone who had probably seen the Blitz as a boy. "You should be ashamed of yourself." The words hung in the air like a sentence, and the visitors who were there agreed with them. Drax's silence was stronger than any punishment could have been. His calm demeanor made him a living example of unbreakable discipline. The crimson bruise on his cheek shone out against his pale complexion, but his gaze stayed fixed straight ahead, not acknowledging the attack or the turmoil that was gathering around him. His immaculate calm in the face of unwarranted assault showed a strength that was greater than anything physical force could do. As more people joined in the chorus of criticism, the crowd's wrath grew. A tourist from the United States used his phone to call for help and plainly spoke with a Midwestern accent as he reported an attack on a British soldier. A French family started talking quickly to each other, and their angry tones didn't need to be translated as they pointed at the red mark on Drax's face. Veylan took a step back, his face pale, as he began to understand how big of a mistake he had made. People around him who were tourists no longer saw a SWAT officer keeping the peace. They saw a bully who had attacked someone who couldn't fight back. Their cameras kept rolling, catching every second of his rising fear as he realized what would happen. The attack on tradition itself had made something never seen before on the royal grounds, turning people who were just watching into active witnesses who wanted justice. Drax's silence and flawless military posture made him look more like a statue than a person. His discipline was raised to something nearly holy by the violence he had undergone without responding. What transpired next would show that striking one Queen's Guard meant battling them all, as centuries of military brotherhood were ready to answer to this unprecedented onslaught on everything they stood for. 10 seconds. That's all it took for the royal grounds to go from being a tourist spot to a military operation that would leave everyone stunned. As the sound of Veylan's slap went away into the wintry air, something strange started to happen around Drax's still body. The tourists were still trying to make sense of what they had seen when they were about to see something much more amazing. 9 seconds. The eastern gateway came alive with activity as 4 guards in full ceremonial attire appeared in perfect formation, their weapons held at the slope position with mechanical accuracy. As they walked with the steady, exact rhythm of soldiers on a mission, their crimson uniforms stood out against the gray stone walls. These weren't actors or entertainers. They were real combat veterans whose perfectly timed steps had been perfected through years of practice and real-life experience on the battlefield. 8 seconds. When the cavalry rode in, their horses' hooves made a loud noise on the cobblestones as they rode out of the stable. The horses snorted clouds of steam into the frigid air. The riders sat up straight in their mounts, and their sabers shone in the weak sunshine as they rode up to the scene with controlled urgency. Even though there was a lot of stress in the air around them, the horses, which were trained for military use, moved with purpose and discipline. 7 seconds. The south gate opened, and the Royal Military Police came out quietly and efficiently. Their green armbands showed that they were the military law enforcement arm. These men were not ceremonial guards. They were dressed in military fatigues and carried modern weapons. Their faces were serious, like professionals responding to a real emergency. Their presence turned the situation from a tourist attraction into a military issue that needed rapid action. 6 seconds. The crowd was amazed as this planned response played out in front of their cameras. They knew they were seeing something that wasn't often shown to the public. Parents pulled their kids higher so they could look over the expanding wall of red uniforms, and the kids stopped weeping. Tourists who thought they were only going to take some pictures ended up recording a lesson in military accuracy and how institutions respond. 5 seconds. It looked like the guards had practiced how to stand in a semicircle around Drax and the increasingly scared Veylan, making it impossible for anyone to get through. Their faces stayed blank, but their presence spoke a lot about how strong an institution can be when it is under siege. The configuration had a lot of uses. It protected their fellow guard, kept the threat contained, and showed that anyone who attacked one of them would have to deal with all of them. 4 seconds. Veylan's face became white when he realized he was no longer facing just one silent guard, but a whole military brotherhood. His gaze moved quickly between the ceremonial guards, the cavalry on horseback, and the Royal Military Police who were coming up behind them. The self-assured policeman who had just hit Drax now appeared like a kid who had wandered into a restricted area and was surrounded by adults who wanted to know what was going on. 3 seconds. The change was complete. What had been a casual tourist gathering turned into a major military event. The guards' weapons shone in the dawn light, and their bayonets were ready. The troops on horseback kept their horses in excellent formation while blocking any possible escape routes. The Royal Military Police moved with the calm confidence of specialists who had trained for this kind of unusual situation. 2 seconds. Corporal Kaelen Drax of the Royal Military Police walked up to Veylan with calm authority, his boots clicking on the cobblestones as he was ready to take charge of the situation. His careful steps and focused look showed that the military chain of command was now involved, turning this from a simple assault into an attack on British military heritage itself. The tourists watched in quiet as the authority of the institution got ready to deal with individual violence. 1 moment. The wall of red uniforms stood still about Drax. Their strictness made a barrier that was stronger than any actual fortification. Each guard's training had prepared him for this moment, when the ritual became real and they had to respond to a threat that had never happened before, as living emblems of British military heritage. Their synchronized breathing and excellent posture showed how the military has changed over the years to protect its own. Nothing. The 10-second answer was full, showing that the Royal Guard's strength was never in any one soldier, but in their unshakable togetherness. Veylan had thought that the one target he saw, was just a single part of a huge military machine that could be mobilized at any time. The constable now had to deal with not only Drax's strict discipline, but also the combined strength of an organization that had protected the crown through global wars, terrorist assaults, and many more threats. The tourists kept filming as they realized they had seen something historic. The moment when confronting one Queen's Guard really meant facing them all. The coordinated response took exactly 10 seconds to show that individual hostility was no match for collective strength. This created the situation for command authority to come and punish Veylan for his terrible judgment. Captain Celine Marrow walked out of the palace's eastern entrance with the steady pace of someone who is used to dealing with problems that shouldn't have happened. Her approach cut through the tension like a knife, and her uniform was spotless, even though she had been called away from her administrative duties to deal with an extraordinary attack on one of her men. Marrow, who was 34 years old, had the quiet assurance of an officer who had won respect through skill rather than rank alone. Her presence changed the situation from chaos to a structured military response right away. It just took her a few seconds to go over the scene, yet she got every important detail. Drax stayed perfectly focused, even though there was a red mark on his cheek. His discipline didn't break even after he was attacked without provocation. Veylan stood alone amid the ceremonial guards, his prior confidence replaced by the pale knowledge that he was up against military power instead of civilian complaint procedures. The visitors kept filming, and their cameras now showed the entrance of command authority to deal with a situation that had gotten out of hand and turned into more than just a fight. Marrow's first goal showed everything there is to know about how to command in the military. She went right up to Drax and spoke to him with quiet authority, calling him by his rank and name. "Lance Corporal Drax, tell me what your situation is," she said in a voice that was both professional and worried. This quick concern for her soldiers' health showed that keeping people safe was more important than anything else, including the ceremonial duties that had put Drax in this hard situation. Drax's answer was short and to the point, like a soldier's, which gave the most information with the fewest words. His report revealed that he was physically able to complete his duties while also admitting to the attack, without losing his ceremonial decorum. Marrow's follow-up questioning about injuries and fitness for duty highlighted how comprehensive the examination had to be when one of her soldiers was attacked while they were powerless to protect themselves. When top authorities showed there, the incident went from being a simple assault to an attack on British military culture. The black Mercedes with official plates came up to the royal gates. Among the people inside was a high-ranking advisor from the royal household, whose presence showed that this transgression had reached the highest levels of concern. These weren't just bureaucrats filling out forms. These were people who had protected organizations that had survived global wars and terrorist attacks. Marrow's treatment of Veylan showed how different real power is from fake power. The constable blurted out excuses and reasons, but the captain stayed cool and professional, which made the constable's desperation seem even more sad. Her calm reactions were very different from his angry defensive conduct. This showed how real leaders function through controlled response instead of reacting with emotion. Corporal Kaelen of the Royal Military Police stepped forward on Marrow's orders, and his approach was backed by military law enforcement. "Constable, I need you to step away from the guard and put your hands where I can see them," he said in a voice that left no room for negotiation. This decisive response turned the scenario from a conflict to an arrest procedure, showing how the right authority handles transgressions by following the rules. The rigorous documentation started right away, and military officers logged every detail with such accuracy that civilian investigators would be jealous. Tourist witness stories, photos of Drax's injury, and a full timeline of events all made a strong case against Veylan. Every fact that was documented made the penalties worse for someone who forgot that having power meant being responsible, not being able to misuse it. Marrow's intervention was able to balance many competing goals thanks to his years of experience as a commander. She defended her troop while keeping up the ceremonial dignity, made sure that the law was followed while keeping up military tradition, and showed institutional power without stooping to the aggressor's level. Her way of doing things showed that real power works through systems that are meant to bring about justice, not personal satisfaction. The captain's cool professionalism made Veylan's earlier rage seem much worse. He had used fear to get her to do what he wanted right away, but she got real benefits by following the rules. He lost control when someone challenged him, while she stayed calm and collected, even though she was in a position that no officer training had prepared her for. The difference showed why one person wore the uniform of a leader, while the other person faced punishment for abusing his power. The swelling number of authorities around the scene made it plain what the institution's interests were. Military police collected evidence. Representatives from the royal household looked into how the damage affected ceremonial protocol, and high-ranking officers made sure that the right people would address this unusual breach. Everyone knew what their responsibility was in protecting something bigger than any one person. Marrow's response to the crisis showed that true power protects rather than attacks, and that justice is served through procedures that make sure people are held accountable. Her calm approach showed respect for both her soldier and the customs he stood for, while also making sure that someone who had crossed every line of professional behavior would receive the right repercussions. It was time for a reckoning that would show why certain blunders cost too much for any career to endure. The sound of the shackles clicking shut around Veylan's wrists seemed to echo through his whole future. Royal Military Police Corporal Kaelen read him his rights in the cool morning air. Drax stayed at his station, and the red mark on his cheek was proof of what occurs when authority is abused. The visitors who had come to take pictures of their vacation now saw a career end in shame, with their cameras catching every moment of Veylan's change from a confident SWAT officer to a criminal defendant. Within hours of the event, the disciplinary machinery began to work, taking away Veylan's power piece by piece with mechanical precision. They took his warrant card right away, and then they took his radio, pepper spray, and handcuffs. Each of these items was a piece of authority he would never have again. SWAT began an internal investigation that would look into every part of his service record, in search of trends that would explain how a sworn officer could attack a soldier who couldn't defend himself. As Veylan's career fell apart, criminal charges piled up upon him like storm clouds. The Crown Prosecution Service charged the man with assault based on many camera footage and dozens of statements from shocked tourists. As investigators learned that hitting a serving soldier while on ceremonial duty was an attack on Crown property, the case went from ordinary violence to an attack on the monarchy itself. His colleagues' police quickly pulled away from what he was doing, like professionals protecting their own reputations. When Veylan walked into the SWAT canteen, it got quiet. People stopped talking in the middle of sentences as they turned away from someone who had broken every rule of professional behavior. When journalists contacted looking for character references, veteran officers who had worked with him for years suddenly couldn't recall his name. The media controversy turned the event into a national icon of authority gone awry, with newspapers showing side-by-side pictures of Drax's calm discipline and Veylan's violent wrath. Television news shows broke into the 10-second response that surrounds the disgraced constable, looking at how appropriate military training had kept a threat at bay while following all the rules. Editorial writers utilized the event to talk about bigger issues, like how SWAT teams act and how they are held accountable. Drax kept doing his ceremonial responsibilities during the investigation. His presence at the royal gates was a constant reminder of what real strength looked like. Veylan was in interview rooms answering questions about his mental state during the attack, while Drax remained there in the rain, snow, and groups of people who were interested in what he had to say. His discipline was not affected by the onslaught he had survived. The differences in how they reacted showed everything about their character under stress. The incident was required viewing in SWAT training academies, and was given as an example of how rapidly officers' careers may fall apart if they forgot their duty to serve and protect. The teachers showed the video of Veylan getting more and more angry, stopping at important points to talk about how de-escalation tactics could have stopped the disaster. The case study parts were mostly on the constable's deadly choice to breach the rope barrier, which was the exact point when frustration turned into criminal behavior. Legal experts were on TV talking about how the legal system works, when someone targets not just a person, but an institution that stands for hundreds of years of British military tradition. The attack on Drax meant more than just hurting him. It went to the heart of ceremonial obligations that linked modern Britain to its ancient roots. Courts took these kinds of crimes very seriously because they knew that targeting symbols of national identity may tear society apart. Protesters with posters that included "Respect our soldiers" and "No badge means no free pass" showed up at Veylan's sentencing hearing to demand accountability for SWAT wrongdoing. The court made it clear that authority came with responsibility, not the right to harm people who couldn't reply. The 6-month prison term was for both the physical attack and the bigger breach of confidence between the police and the people they served. The court-ordered psychological evaluation showed that the man had a distorted sense of authority that made him feel like silence was rebellion, that needed a violent response. Veylan had a hard time explaining his actions, even to himself. He said that the guard's silence was strangely disrespectful to his SWAT suit. The assessment showed that the person had forgotten that real power comes from earning respect instead of forcing it. Someone who had a criminal record that includes attacking a distinguished veteran while on ceremonial duty had no chance of getting a job. Security companies turned down his applications right away, since they knew that hiring someone who had attacked a Queen's Guard would ruin their business with government contracts. Even private companies that did background checks found the viral videos of his breakdown, which made him unfit for any job that required public trust. The cost of crossing the line showed that some mistakes have consequences that are too harsh for any career to endure. It will always be a warning that authority without discipline is just sanctioned bullying waiting for its final end. Drax's complete calm in the face of Veylan's attack showed a strength that no amount of aggression could match. This showed the big difference between reactive violence and disciplined force. His body took the hit without flinching, and his stance stayed absolutely straight, as if the slap had been nothing more than a little breeze. The red bruise on his cheek showed that he had been attacked, but his calm demeanor turned what should have been a humiliating moment into a show of strength that left everyone awestruck. As the morning went on, the difference between these two definitions of authority couldn't have been more clear in front of the palace gates. Veylan's violent claim was the most basic type of power, driven by anger and the urge to feel better than someone who wouldn't accept his control. His aggression showed weakness, pretending to be strength, showing that he had forgotten that true power comes from earning respect instead than demanding it by force. Drax's practiced restraint, on the other hand, showed that he understood what real power was on a deeper level. His quiet said a lot about the warrior underneath the ceremonial outfit. He had learned during 3 deployments in Afghanistan that choosing conflicts judiciously was frequently the key to survival. He had learned from his time in fighting that real warriors don't fight every time they are provoked. Instead, they choose their battles with strategic precision, knowing that sometimes the best victory is to not fight at all. Drax was ready for this moment because he had been on 3 combat deployments. However, he never thought he would have to face such a challenge while doing ceremonial duties. The mountains of Afghanistan had taught him that in order to be alive, he needed to be able to maintain calm under a lot of stress and think clearly when things were crazy around him. Those lessons were excellent for this new situation, because reacting to provocation would have gone against all his uniform stood for. Drax's quiet was stronger than any punishment could have been, making him a real example of what unshakable character looks like when things become tough. By not admitting to the assault and not giving Veylan the satisfaction of a reaction, he made himself look better in the eyes of everyone who saw it. The tourists who came to see a ceremonial guard instead saw something much deeper, a masterclass in how to keep your dignity when someone attacks you without reason. Drax's answer showed that self-control is the strongest form of strength, and it takes more fortitude than hitting back ever could. Anyone can punch someone when they're mad, but it takes a lot of self-control to stay calm and take a hit. His self-control showed that he was in charge of his own desires, which shows that the hardest battles are often fought and won in one's own mind. The crowd's support was based on dignity rather than hostility, which shows what people really value when faced with obvious moral choices. People were outraged not because Drax didn't respond, but because Veylan broke basic rules of civility. The tourists intuitively knew they were seeing something exceptional in Drax's steadfast focus. They could tell real strength when they saw it portrayed with such calm might. Drax's response honored his uniform, his training, and the hundreds of years of tradition he stood for during his vigil. By refusing to change his ceremonial stance, he honored the values that had connected him to generations of guards who had stood their stations through world wars, terrorist threats, and numerous other provocations. His discipline connected the past and the present, showing that some values are more important than any one crisis. The event turned into a master class in how to deal with provocation with grace under the most intense pressure. Drax was able to stay calm while being physically attacked in front of dozens of witnesses. This level of self-control is hard for most people to achieve in normal situations, let alone during such an unusual breach of protocol. His ability to handle stress showed how strong his character was, and how well his military training worked. Military experts later said that Drax's response was a great illustration of how to think strategically in a scenario that seemed insurmountable. By staying in his job instead of seeking justice through revenge, he protected both his own honor and the organization he worked for. Drax showed that real fighters know when not to fight, as well as when to take action by letting the system deal with Veylan's crime through the right channels. Drax's unshakable discipline showed the actual definition of strength. It showed that real power doesn't come from being able to hurt others, but from having the courage to stay strong when faced with unjustified hostility. His answer raised him from the role of ceremonial guard to something like a legend, a living example of what human character can do when it is properly taught and firmly committed to ideas that are more important than personal happiness. This amazing show of self-control under pressure taught everyone there that respect and tradition-based authority is much stronger than power based on fear and violence. This set the stage for understanding how group unity can always beat individual aggression. This fight showed us that real authority comes from earning respect, not forcing it on others. It also taught us that the best way to deal with violence is sometimes to do nothing at all. Drax's silence spoke louder than any words could have. His discipline turned a violent situation into a lesson about real strength. Lance Corporal Drax's calmness and the quick help of his other guards showed that group discipline is always better than individual aggressiveness. Their 10-second response showed that the institution's authority came from years of history, not from rage at the moment. When you see someone being bullied, remember this lesson. True strength is quiet, unshaken, and finally wins.